Ontario has a waste problem. Every year, Ontario produces nearly 1 ton of waste per person, and 3/4 of this ends up in landfill. The new Waste-Free Ontario Act sets an ambitious goal of a circular economy that sends no waste to landfill. Will it take us there? Today, I am pleased to present a special report to the Legislative Assembly. Beyond the Blue Box reports on the provincial government's ambitious new law, the Waste-Free Ontario Act of 2016, Ontario rarely adopts a new environmental statute. This new law and the strategy for a waste-free Ontario are a significant achievement and can give a fresh start to Ontario's waste policy. In this report, I summarize key lessons from Ontario's first 40 years of trying to divert waste from landfill and use them to understand the main challenges ahead. For economic, environmental, and climate reasons, Ontario must make better use of resources and transform our current pattern of take, use, and throw away into a circular economy. In the circular economy, things last longer and resources are used over and over. Governance, transparency, and accountability were key problems under the old law, the Waste Diversion Act of 2002. The new law has created a framework that should better match power with accountability. For example, it puts responsibility for each company's waste back on that company, rather than blurring financial signals and obscuring responsibility with an opaque monopoly. But better governance, transparency, and accountability are not enough. We need better results. Ontario is rightfully proud of the Blue Box, which recycles paper and packaging from homes. But the Blue Box only handles the least harmful wastes. It has been a burden on taxpayers, and it diverts less than 8% of Ontario's waste. The new strategy will improve the Blue Box. But for real impact, the government needs to take action on the big waste streams that have been ignored for too long. For example, Ontario needs to get food waste, organics, out of landfills. For one thing, we just shouldn't throw out so much food. For another, food waste uses up landfill space, creates pollution, and releases methane, a potent greenhouse gas. Instead, it should be a source of renewable energy and a way to repair damaged soils. Nova Scotia banned organics from landfill 20 years ago. Second, Ontario shouldn't let businesses and institutions keep on creating so much waste. Businesses and institutions send 6.7 million tons of waste to landfill Ontario business institutions send 6.7 million tons of waste to landfill each year. The overwhelming majority of waste from malls, factories, construction sites, hospitals, restaurants, and other businesses end up in landfill. This causes pollution and throws away valuable resources that should have been reused. And it keeps us locked into a take, use once, and throw away mentality, cheaper in the short run but much more expensive over time. In the long run, what matters most is moving Ontario to a circular economy. That means keeping products and materials in high-value use for as long as possible. Decades of experience have shown that passing a new law is not enough by itself to achieve these kinds of changes. But by paying attention to what has worked in the last 40 years, the government can make the Waste-Free Ontario Act effective in improving Ontario's environmental footprint. By now, for example, we should have learned that good waste policy is not one size fits all. Reduction and reuse have to come first. Recycling does not always pay for itself. Government needs to foster markets for collected materials, and when businesses are allowed to transfer costs onto consumers and taxpayers, they will. For most Ontarians and most materials, it remains cheaper to buy new stuff, use it briefly, and then throw it away, than to reuse those resources over and over. This is partly due to culture and habit, partly to government policy, and partly to the high cost of labor in comparison to the cost of materials. Government must help change the cultural and economic causes of these habits while enforcing tough standards for waste reduction, reuse, and recycling. It will take some adjustment. But research shows the huge economic and employment promise of a low-waste economy. Scotland, for example, with less than half of Ontario's population, has become a world leader on the circular economy. Its Making Things Last strategy is predicted to add up to £1.5 billion, $2.5 billion, to its economy every year, including 5,700 new jobs in remanufacturing alone. For Scotland and for us, a more circular economy where we make things last is an economic, environmental, and moral necessity. It will help conserve our finite resources, help support jobs in our communities, and improve our quality of life. It just makes good sense. Thank you, merci. Any questions?
I wonder if you could elaborate on, I guess, the answer to the question you posed at the beginning. Will this law take us there? Will we ever get to zero waste?
Ever is a long time. I think that the law and the strategy and the support that have been gained through the stakeholder process will certainly set us on the path in the right direction. We've pointed to two big areas that the government could move on quickly that are really important in that way. Number one being to get organics out of landfill, and number two, to get businesses to pull their weight. Zero waste is really ambitious, but we could do enormously better than we are now, and the government has the tools to do that.
Such as?
Well, the new act clearly makes it possible to provide bans. We have the examples of Metro Vancouver, PEI, and of course Nova Scotia, who've already banned organics from landfill. Scotland and California are going in the same direction. It's a relatively easy thing to do with a big impact. Organic waste is heavy. It's one of the largest contributors to leachate, which contaminates groundwater. It's the major source of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas that, as I reported earlier, the government methodically underestimates. Methane itself also contributes to ground level air pollution and as well helps create ozone, which is another greenhouse gas. So there's a lot of reasons to deal with organics. And at the very same time, we have the Climate Action Plan and the urgent need to displace fossil fuels. And methane is a very valid, usable fuel that can go directly into the natural gas grid. So we have so many advantages to be gained by not throwing them into landfills. And we have lots of precedents around the world of how to make it work. It's just time to do it.
How are you going to hold businesses accountable? For instance, I had a microwave 3 years old. It stopped working, and to replace it or fix it, it was going to be too much, so we had to buy a new one. Same thing with our laundry machine. We bought top of the line. 5 years, it caught fire, so we had to get a replacement. When they came, they said it's going to cost too much. So how are you going to hold manufacturers and companies accountable for the quality, I guess, of their products?
Well, there are a number of different ways to go about it. One of the things we pointed out last year on our energy report is we have a lot of standards and labeling, such as Energy Star, for appliances. But they only look at the energy during use. They do not look at durability. I understand that most of the refrigerators in the world get replaced because the compressor fails, and I'm told that usually the reason the compressor fails is that the ball bearing seize up, and that so basically you throw away the whole thing for the lack of a couple of milliliters of oil around the ball bearings. They're designed that way because we've allowed them to be designed that way. There isn't any God-given reason why refrigerators couldn't have removable, replaceable, whatever holds the ball bearings, so that you could use them for years and years. And we have not considered durability an important item either in government standards, in government procurement, in labeling, in consumer education, or, as you say, in any kind of liability rules. And so we have made it possible for industries to sell us things that we have to replace on a regular basis and throw out. It doesn't have to be that way. One of the best examples in the world, I understand, is the Land Rover. It's a car that can last a long, long time. It's not fancy, but it's easy to fix. And I read that some huge percentage of the Land Rovers ever sold are still in use because people can fix them. Well, we could have that same model for other things.
And what do you suggest people at home do to reduce their waste? We already are recycling, we've got the green bin, we've got the blue bin. So what are you suggesting that we individually should be doing?
The most, well, first of all, of course, getting the right stuff in the right bin, which I know is a challenge. I struggle with my son still, but getting the right stuff in the right bin is certainly important. But the biggest thing is to buy things, use them a long time, instead of buying lots of things and throwing them out. So buying for durability and buying good quality stuff that lasts is the single most important thing individuals can do. But as in any other area of public life, speaking up is also important. I mean, I don't know if any of the politicians in this building have ever had a constituent say to them, what are you doing about durability? Right? We just haven't dealt with it. And we could. So again, people say, well, you know, we're only 13 million people, how can we make changes? And we saw that in the history of the Blue Box in 2006. The minister of the day did try to say to the stewards, well, what are you doing to increasing the recyclability and reuse of your products? And they said nothing, and he didn't do anything. So if Scotland can do it, so can we.
Does the new green bin in Toronto, will that help? I mean, it's larger and it's easier to move to the curb than the old one that you had to sort of bend over. And, I mean, we always use them, but I don't know if everyone always did because they were such a pain to use. Will the new ones add to or contribute to less organic waste going to landfills, do you think?
Well, they should. It certainly helps that they have more room. So if you have people in diapers, for example, you can generate an awful lot of diapers in a fairly short period of time. And if you happen to have 3 little boys in diapers at the same time, you can get a lot of diapers. So just having a larger bin definitely helps. We've seen some of the major municipalities in the GTA do really well. The region of York, for example, has a residential home diversion rate of about 60%, which is great. Part of it is also a question of just people getting used to the idea and getting used to the idea that they and their neighbors are doing it together. There is a little bit of yuck when you have to think about where is this and where is it going, but it's not that hard. Once you're changing the diaper, throwing it in the right bin is the easy part.
Now, you say that you want to get all food waste out of landfills, so where do you want the food waste to go? Do you want people composting at home? I mean, what are you asking for people to do with regard to that?
I have a composter at home, well, 2 actually, because I'm a gardener and I really like to have the benefit of the compost in the soil in my garden. But there are 2 major things that can be done with organic waste. Number 1 is anaerobic digestion, and I talked about that in my spring energy report. The anaerobic digestion, which basically means you put the organics in a closed body without oxygen, and what you get is methane. And so a number of the sewage treatment plants have it, and there's more and more work being done on generating methane from organic waste as well, and then that can be used either as a transportation fuel. City of Toronto is looking to run more and more of their garbage trucks on methane from their landfill. They can go directly, and you probably know that Hamilton runs some of its buses on methane from, I think, mostly poop. Am I allowed to say that? From the sewage treatment plant. It can also go into the natural gas grid. So anaerobic digestion, really big potential, and has the additional benefit not only capturing the methane from the organics, so it doesn't go in the air, but also displacing fossil fuel. The other way to treat organics is to compost it. I understand that Nova Scotia, for example, which I mentioned, they have had an organic ban for 20 years. And they have composting facilities all around the province, and so they create this good quality compost which can go back into agricultural soils, residential soils, you know, anywhere you need good soil, which is most places.
Madame Sachs, vous dites dans votre rapport que le nouveau plan paraît spectaculaire sur papier, mais est-ce que vous dites que c'est un peu de la poudre aux yeux, c'est des apparences?
Excuse me, I'm going to answer in English.
I know you speak French also.
I do, but I didn't get time to study this week. I apologize. The strategy has got all kinds of great ideas, and I'm really pleased to see the direction and the awareness that the government has of where they need to go. But having a strategy and actually doing things is not always the same thing, and we were particularly concerned that there aren't any actual dates. There's also a lack of a source of revenue having been identified for the particular actions that the government is going to take. Now, once they designate a particular waste, then the RIPRA, the authority, will be able to impose fees on the stewards, and they'll be able to use that for programs. So, for example, the Ontario Tire Stewardship, they, through the fees they put on for tires, have been able to create, we understand, more than 200 jobs in Ontario, and a number of innovative products using the waste. And that kind of thing is really necessary. When you're trying to shift an economy, you need to have a source of money to figure out what to do, because it isn't all obvious ahead of time. So that's one thing that does concern me. The government, for the last 2 years, really did do a tremendously good job, I would say for the first time in quite some time, on getting the stakeholders together and getting serious about moving forward. But now, will they actually do it? That's what concerns me. Whoever the government of the day is, we want to see them moving on these issues. They really are no-brainers. We know we need to do them. We've spent decades getting to the point of recognizing we need to do them. Now we need to actually do them. And that's hopefully by us holding our flashlight on that and you writing about it, that will increase the likelihood of the government paying attention.
Is there enough verification? Some companies say they recycle. The reality is that they put everything to the trash. So is there enough surveillance from the government?
Well, one of the things that we were very pleased about in the bill is the emphasis on data and transparency. It was a huge problem under the previous regime that, for example, Stewardship Ontario was the only one who had data on what companies were doing, and they wouldn't give that data to anyone, nor was it clear what they did with the data or how they assigned the fees. So now that data will be collected from the service providers as well as from the companies, and that will help. So I am looking forward to that, and that's something that I hope I'll get an opportunity to look at later, is how well has the data been collected, what does it show? What we did see in Germany when they changed their system from a monopoly system such as the one we have now to a more competitive system based on open data was more innovation, much more competition for the material, and lower costs. And I'm optimistic that the data will do the same here.
What about the packaging? I've got 3 tiny kids, so I mean, every time there's presents coming into the house, birthday parties, there is so much packaging. And I know there's been discussion in the past about reducing the packaging for toys and whatnot, but it doesn't seem to be happening. So what are you suggesting with regard to that?
You're absolutely right about packaging. One of the reasons we've emphasized in here how important it is to look at reuse and reduction and reuse before recycling is we've really had the cart in front of the horse all this time. One of the quotes that I saw out of a European study was, we've been treating the blue box, basically, the recycling, as 70 or 80% of the answer, and it should be 5% of the answer. But what has happened over the years is that because most of the cost of dealing with packaging has been borne by the public sector, by municipal taxpayers, both through litter and through blue box, it hasn't really been important to the producers to change it. So you think about bottled water, for example. The bottled water company said, look, we have reduced our packaging, but what they meant by that was they had made the bottles thinner. So that made it cheaper for them, but it made it much more expensive for recycling, because where you used to have 35,000 bottles would give you a ton of plastic, now you had to handle and wash and take the labels off and the tops off 70,000 bottles to get the same ton of plastic. So the new structure, once the blue box is transitioned, will be to make the producer responsible, hopefully for as much as possible of the costs at end of life, and that might lead them to do it differently. They might not make the bottles any thicker, but they might, for example, change the way they glue the labels on. Because one of the things that makes recyclers crazy is how hard it is to get off the labels. And when they change the glue, it can make the recycler's job even more difficult.
I'm looking there, there's 5 bins.
Yeah, sorry, that's just an artistic idea. I didn't actually have an idea for a purple bin. I think in Germany they have 4. One of them's yellow, but
How many do you suggest we have?
I don't have an answer to that. I'd like to see, as I said, more emphasis at the front end so that we're not throwing out as much. But one of the real pushes that I thought was a terrible mistake through the blue box was to push municipalities towards a one-bin system where you mix the paper and the plastic and everything else. And stewards insisted on this, but we know that it results in a poorer quality of material, less reusability, more contamination, lower economic value. And so if we could go back to separating things better, we produce a higher quality material for which there are more markets. There is also a need for research. One of the interesting projects that was funded with the tires stewardship money was a professor at Waterloo who's looking how to devulcanize rubber. Now, I couldn't tell you how to vulcanize rubber, and I certainly can't tell you how to devulcanize rubber, but apparently devulcanizing rubber is a key step for having the crumb go back to being able to use for virgin purposes. So as we have more innovations like that, it'll be clearer what needs to be separate from what in order to make a vibrant market. One of the things we're really emphasizing is the attention has to be on what will it take to make a market. And that really means, okay, the people who can use these materials, what do they need? And they need a predictable quality of a certain kind of stuff. Well, what will it take to produce that to them? And whether it's home separation, separation at transfer sites, some kind of better device to separate things, I don't know. But I'd start with what do the buyers need and work backward. That's the way the rest of the market works.
Are the cities doing enough?
Municipalities in Ontario have been doing really quite a lot and have spent an enormous money. We have, some real innovators. As I say, you look at every municipality that has a green bin. They did that voluntarily. The province didn't make them do it and doesn't help them do it. In Nova Scotia, it's province-wide that there is a green bin system. We have left the municipalities to themselves. Once more of the blue box costs are taken off the backs of the municipalities and put back on the producers where they belong, municipalities will have a little more money to deal with other things. And I think we will continue to see the municipalities innovate. As I think I mentioned earlier, I'm also seeing a lot of interest in municipalities in going down the road that we suggested in the spring for sewage plants. How can they become renewable energy centers? Same thing with waste. How can they take a more integrated approach to their waste, look at it as resources, and make something useful out of it? We could also see that with aggregates. We know that aggregate pits cause a great deal of environmental damage, and at the very same time we're throwing out a lot of construction waste. Well, why don't we put those two things together and make better use and reuse the aggregates that we already have? So there are a lot of opportunities, and one of the things I'm hopeful about the strategy is if the province keeps its eye on the ball, we could unleash a lot of creativity in municipalities and in the private sector. There's a lot of people who have great ideas. Sometimes they need a helping hand. Sometimes they just need a way through the Kafkaesque approval system that the Ministry of Environment has. And then once they get going, they can do great things. It's lovely here in Moose Creek, Ontario. They've got a tire recycling facility where they're making flooring for people who work where they have to stand in industries, and also apparently for happy cows. So creating local employment and keeping tires in good use.
Do those comments apply to the
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Do those comments apply to the anaerobic digestion and composting facilities too? I know right now there's a lot of private sector, privately run anaerobic digesters versus just a few municipally run ones.
Yes.
Should there be more of a role for the private sector there? Would that help get things going quicker on the end product?
I don't have any particular brief for one or the other. Both the private sector and the public sector need to get through the ministry approval process, which is notoriously backed up. One of our recommendations was specifically that the ministry needs to make the approval process for these organic diversion facilities faster and more predictable. They still have to protect the environment, of course, but using environmental laws to prevent good environmental outcomes isn't a good result.
Thank you.
All right, well, merci. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your understanding. Thanks, everybody.